The individual renowned throughout history as Oskar Schindler was born in Zwickau, Moravia, on April 28, 1908, in the territory that is now the Czech Republic but was formerly the Empire of Austria-Hungary. Hans, the pseudonym of Johann Schindler, was the proprietor of a company specializing in agricultural machinery. His mother, Franziska Schindler, née Lusser, was an unmarried individual. Elfriede, her daughter, was the only additional child she and Hans had together. She was born in 1915. The Schindlers resided in the Sudetenland, a region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This region, in contrast to the majority of the territory that would eventually form the Czech Republic, was predominantly populated by ethnic Sudeten Germans as opposed to Czechs. Thus, the cultural proximity of the Sudetenland to Germany was greater than that of Prague, which was situated merely several hours distant. During his childhood, Schindler and every single one of his acquaintances would have spoken German as their native tongue. Oskar experienced a turbulent early childhood during his formative years in this location. His father was a deeply troubled individual who was emotionally disturbed and involved in extramarital affairs while abusing alcohol heavily. There were allegations that he once violated his sister-in-law while intoxicated. This allegedly led to the conception of an illegitimate child, Oskar's half-sister, who sadly passed away during her youth. It is not remarkable that the father-son relationship was antagonistic from the very beginning. The local elementary and secondary institutions were attended by Oskar. Although he did not precisely demonstrate a strong commitment to learning, there exists a distressing dearth of information regarding his childhood. Despite this, Schindler made no effort to rectify the situation during subsequent interviews. During Oskar's childhood, events were transpiring throughout Europe that would later have profound ramifications for both the continent and Schindler's personal trajectory in life. They would also grant him the citizenship of an additional nation prior to his adolescence. The great powers of Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, have been on a collision course with one another since the 1870s. This trajectory was fueled by nationalism and competition between Austria-Hungary and Russia for territory in the Balkans following the fall of the Ottoman Empire and colonial rivalry in the scramble for Africa. Ultimately, these latent tensions escalated into a state of war during the summer of 1914, when a crisis that had developed between the Austro-Hungarian government and the Kingdom of Serbia in the Balkans became unmanageable. An alliance of Great Britain, France, and Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary and Germany in early August. These countries were also allied with Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. The dispute would inevitably escalate into the First World War, with the eventual involvement of major powers including the United States and Japan. As a consequence, Germany and Austria-Hungary encountered insurmountable challenges, culminating in their ultimate defeat in the War of 1918 as the two Central European powers. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was already confronted with a crisis prior to the conclusion of the war, which would ultimately have far-reaching consequences for Schindler's birthplace in the Sudetenland. In the late summer and early autumn of 1918, as it became evident that the war effort was doomed, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, composed of numerous nationalities including Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Slovaks, and Serbs, started to disintegrate. Several weeks prior to the official conclusion of the First World War, in October 1918, separatists from Czechoslovakia and Slovakia in the northern regions of the empire proclaimed their independence from Vienna and declared the formation of a new independent state. This included the Sudetenland, Schindler's birthplace, a territory that, like the Schindlers, consisted significantly more of ethnically German families than Czech or Slovak ones. Regarding predominantly German regions of their new nation, such as the Sudetenland, the Czechoslovak government was uncertain of how to proceed in the aftermath of the war and requested that the major wartime victors, Britain, France, and the United States, judge the matter during the 1919 peace negotiations at Versailles outside of Paris. In the aftermath of the war, it was widely agreed that both Germany and Austria ought to be weakened to the greatest extent possible. Therefore, as stipulated in the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which governed the post-conflict settlement in the territories formerly under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Sudetenland would continue to be a constituent of the recently established nation of Czechoslovakia. As a result, beginning in 1918, Schindler developed into an adult citizen of this newly formed nation. However, the matter of the Sudetenland would resurface in the near future. Schindler attended a technical school in the early 1920s, having barely completed secondary education. However, he was expelled from this institution in 1924, shortly after enrolling, for forging his grade report. He was eventually granted permission to return, but his peers thereafter began to refer to him as Schindler the Crook. During this period, he encountered additional criminal issues in addition to the one mentioned at this time. A portion of Hans Schindler's clients accused him of embezzlement in 1925. Schindler had been selling insurance premiums as a side gig to supplement his income. Hans, in turn, ascribed responsibility for the crime to his son. However, Oskar's wife would later assert that Hans was the true culprit, many years later. Whoever was responsible, Oskar encountered additional legal complications as a consequence, all the while being on the verge of his 18th birthday. Eventually, however, he was granted permission to return to the technical college from which he had been expelled. He graduated. After this, he traveled to Brno, a larger city in the Czech Republic, where he enrolled in numerous courses pertaining to HVAC maintenance, machinery operation, and chauffeuring. By passing these examinations, he gained employment in the family enterprise. In the autumn of 1927, Oskar encountered his prospective spouse. 7 months elder than Oskar, Emily Millie Pelzel was a native of the village of Stare Malatin, located approximately 40 kilometers from Zwittau. In contrast to the Schindlers, her father was a prosperous farmer, and the Pelzels led a harmonious family life. Their initial encounter occurred when Oskar, who had intermittently worked for his father's business since 1924, visited the Pelzel farm for business purposes and attempted to sell Emily's father an indoor electric generator. Evidently smitten with Emily from the moment they first met, Oskar continued to pay the Pelzel farm visits thereafter, fabricating excuses involving farm apparatus and the like, but which were, in reality, attempts to woo Emily. Following its successful implementation over the course of several weeks, she agreed to his marriage proposal. They were wed on March 6, 1928, but the union was problematic from the very beginning. The upstairs of the Schindler residence was occupied by the newlyweds, but Hans Schindler's excessive drinking and vulgar behavior proved to be problematic. It was the start of a 30-year union that would be marked by numerous peaks and valleys. The years that ensued were not significantly improved. Upon his matrimonial union with Emily's father, Oskar was bestowed with a substantial dowry. However, in 1928, he employed a portion of this dowry in a somewhat imprudent manner, as it was intended to fund his ambition of becoming a racing car driver. This business failed within a few months, resulting in the depletion of a significant portion of their capital. Subsequently, he resigned from his father's employ and accepted a position with the Moravian Electric Company in Brno. However, this also proved unsuccessful, and he established a racing school instead. Once more, this was disrupted by a military service of 18 months during which he enlisted in the 10th Infantry Regiment of the Czechoslovak Army, ultimately attaining the rank of Lance Corporal. Nevertheless, considering the circumstances of the late 1920s and early 1930s, it seemed improbable that Czechoslovakia would be involved in a conflict. Oskar later reflected that his conscription period was primarily occupied with leisure pursuits rather than active military service. After completing his military service, he resumed employment with the Moravian Electric Company. However, due to the economic downturn that afflicted Europe in the 1930s, the company was forced to cease operations shortly thereafter. Amidst this milieu, Emily commenced to scrutinize Oskar for the mismanagement of the funds he had been given by her father on their 1928 wedding. An additional issue, however, was nevertheless escalating. Regarding alcohol, Oskar had inherited his father's predilection. This had been a minor concern since the inception of his matrimonial union with Emily. However, it escalated into a significant obstacle in the early 1930s, when he encountered unemployment and a state of uncertainty. On two separate occasions in 1931 and 1932, he was apprehended for public intoxication and held in custody for a duration of 24 hours prior to his release after a fine was imposed. Nevertheless, despite this initial encounter with apprehension, Oskar was acquitted of 2 additional arrests prior to the conclusion of 1932. Ultimately, he received a 4-day incarceration term and a fine of 200 crowns, which, considering the circumstances of the childless couple and the unemployed man, were not inconsequential amounts of money. Although circumstances gradually improved thereafter, it was not the last time he encountered legal issues. In fact, his alcoholism worsened, albeit with fewer encounters with the authorities. If it gradually came under greater control, it was because Oskar obtained a new position with the Yaroslav Simek Bank in Prague later in 1932. He would remain employed there for a period of 6 years. Subsequent to his employment, he and Emily relocated to a sizable residence, which she subsequently characterized as a mansion in contrast to the former Schindler residence. Additional challenges awaited during this time period. During the early 1930s, Oskar, who had also inherited his father's propensity for extramarital affairs, initiated a relationship with Aurelie Schlegel, a woman he had known since his youth and who had been employed as Hans Schindler's secretary. 2 illegitimate offspring, Edith and Oskar Jr., were born shortly thereafter. Emily, with whom Oskar had never had any offspring, appeared to have acquired complete knowledge of the affair, and the children delivered outside of wedlock at some juncture. Perhaps Oskar was a negligent parent in part because he had initial doubts about his paternity as the father of Edith and Oskar Jr. At this juncture, one might question why Emily remained by his side during the initially difficult years of their marriage. Despite his flaws, Oskar had a big heart and was always willing to assist those in need, she later remarked. Although he was affable, kind, extraordinarily benevolent, and charitable, he lacked any discernible sense of maturity. He consistently engaged in deceit and falsehood, and subsequently apologized, akin to a young boy caught in mischief, pleading for forgiveness once more, and we would resume our journey. This described a significant portion of Schindler's life. Beginning in the early 1930s, his pattern of behavior included drinking, extramarital affairs, and precarious finances. During the early 1930s, as Schindler's personal life became more turbulent, parallel developments were taking place outside the borders of Czechoslovakia that would consequently impact Oskar's life, the life of his country, and ultimately, global affairs. Immediate post-1918 political unrest and revolution characterized neighboring Germany's situation following the conclusion of the First World War. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the imperial ruler of Germany, renounced his position during the final days of the conflict, effectively terminating the empire. Subsequently, a novel republic was established. However, it incited profound turmoil and revolutions in major cities such as Berlin and Munich, as communists and socialists endeavored to seize authority in a manner reminiscent of the Bolsheviks' 1917 Russian Revolution. Right-wing German nationalists organized a counter-revolution in opposition to this left-wing revolution. One of the most radical political movements to result was the Nazis, or National Socialist German Workers' Party, which was led by Adolf Hitler. The Nazis promptly launched an uprising in November 1923 at their strategic stronghold in Bavaria, motivated by an ideology of vengeance for Germany's humiliation and territorial loss during the First World War and a conspiracy theory positing that Jews and communists were conspiring to ruin Germany. Due to the failure of this uprising and the subsequent political stabilization in Germany during the mid-1920s, the Nazis remained a minor political force in southern Germany for the majority of the 1920s. However, everything shifted by late 1929. The economic expansion that had been advantageous for Europe and the Americas for several years abruptly ended that autumn, when the stock markets on Wall Street in New York City suffered enormous losses. Germany was hit especially hard by the Great Depression due to its enormous national debt, which was incurred as a result of Britain and France imposing enormous war reparations payments at the conclusion of the First World War. As average Germans experienced unemployment and the depletion of their life assets, millions of Germans gravitated towards increasingly radical political organizations. The Nazi Party experienced a meteoric rise in popularity, ascending from the second largest political party in the nation in the 1930 elections to the largest in 1932. Although the political establishment attempted to impede their rise for a period of time, Hitler was ultimately appointed Chancellor of Germany in January 1933. The Nazis quickly seized dictatorial control of power after the Enabling Act was passed in the spring of 1933, allowing them to rule by decree. The advent of the Nazis marked a significant shift in the political terrain of Europe, as their ideological platform entailed the unification of all regions of Europe that were primarily inhabited by Germans under the governance of a single state, the Third Reich, a new German empire. This included Austria, portions of Western Poland, and Schindler's birthplace, Sudetenland. The personal politics of Schindler are a subject of intense debate. Following his 1931 visit to Berlin, he conveyed some benevolence towards the Communist Party in that city. It is therefore peculiar to discover that he joined the Sudeten German Party in 1935. This political organization, founded in Czechoslovakia shortly after the Nazis acquired power in Germany, sought to incite separatist sentiment and activity in the Sudetenland. The party's ultimate objective was to acquire control of the Sudetenland for the Germans. When evaluating this and a significant portion of Schindler's endeavors during the mid to late 1930s, it is crucial to bear in mind that Schindler, similar to numerous other Nazi supporters, was unable to foresee the magnitude of the genocidal carnage that would ensue throughout Europe in the coming decades. He became a member of the party on the grounds that he was a German nationalist, who, along with a vast majority of ethnically Germans in the Sudetenland, desired the region's unification with Germany. Amidst these circumstances, Schindler also encountered a profound personal tragedy, the demise of his cherished mother in 1935. During her final illness, Hans Schindler abandoned her, and Oskar, whose relationship with his father had been strained at best from the beginning, never absolved him. However, the two did achieve a partial reconciliation in 1941, several years later. Meanwhile, Schindler's financial and alcohol-related issues persisted into the mid-1930s. Subsequently, he maintained that these were the rationales behind his 1936 enlistment in the Abwehr. However, his spouse subsequently testified that their initial encounter was via an affair with a woman affiliated with the organization whom he encountered while on a business trip to Krakow, Poland. Established in 1920, during the time of the German Weimar Republic, the Abwehr was the German intelligence agency. Upon assuming power in Germany, the Nazi regime expeditiously transformed it into a foreign intelligence instrument, employing it to undermine Germany's neighboring countries, notably Poland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, all of which contained territory that the Nazis aspired to incorporate into Greater Germany. It appears that Schindler's primary involvement with the organization consisted of recruiting individuals, particularly those occupying influential positions in business and finance. This was a task that Schindler was highly qualified for, considering his extensive experience in diverse business positions and his 1932 appointment to the Yaroslav Simek Bank in Prague. It appears that recruitment did not constitute the sole undertaking of Schindler for the Abwehr during the mid-1930s. Additionally, he participated in the gathering of data pertaining to the railway system, military installations, and the Czechoslovak army. Schindler was exceptionally qualified to execute each of these duties. His recent service in the Czechoslovak army endowed him with extensive connections within the organization and extensive personal connections therewith, all the while engaging in extensive business travel that served as a pretext for gathering intelligence and meeting new contacts. Furthermore, the purpose for which he was collecting the information is beyond reasonable doubt. Its objective was to strategize for a possible German invasion of the nation, with the intention of either capturing the Sudetenland or the entirety of Czechoslovakia. Furthermore, he progressively engaged in the documentation of internal circumstances in Poland, a relationship with the nation that would yield significant repercussions in the years to come. Later on, Oskar attempted to minimize the gravity of his involvement with the Abwehr, claiming he was a minor player who got himself into trouble while seeking additional funds to settle his mounting debts. However, others testified that Schindler was one of the highest-ranking German intelligence agents in Czechoslovakia throughout these years. The aforementioned assessment appears to be supported by his apprehension and subsequent several-month detention by the Czechoslovak government in the summer of 1938 on charges of espionage. With the increasing collaboration of Schindler with the Abwehr and the Nazis in Czechoslovakia, the Nazi regime in Germany escalated its aggression towards other nations. As per the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles, which officially terminated the First World War and finalized the specific peace terms with Germany, the nation was strictly forbidden from possessing an air force and from establishing an army exceeding 100,000 men. However, in 1935, the Nazi regime publicly avowed its intention to violate these restrictions and immediately commenced the construction of an additional air force and the recruitment of more than 500,000 soldiers. The demilitarized Rhineland region of Western Germany, which had been established in accordance with the provisions of Versailles, was remilitarized the following year. Then, as the unstoppable progression towards war continued, Hitler began communicating his desire for Austria to unite with Germany into Greater Germany to the European powers. The notion had been momentarily put forth in the aftermath of the First World War. However, it was promptly rejected by Britain and other nations. Although a considerable number of Austrians supported the notion, the conservative right-wing government made every effort to oppose it. Vienna, however, reached a consensus in March 1938 to conduct a referendum regarding the subject. Prior to its actualization, Hitler deployed the newly formed German army into Austria. The Anschluss, the period of association between the two nations, was peacefully concluded in the days that followed. Despite this, Nazi claims on foreign territory persisted. Hitler, as soon as Nazi flags began to flutter above Vienna, shifted his focus to Schindler's birthplace, Sudetenland. He initiated a discourse with the governments of London, Paris, and Rome, contending that this area ought never to have been permitted to be a part of Czechoslovakia in the first place, given that its inhabitants were predominantly German-speaking and of German ethnic descent. Moreover, in Czechoslovakia, the Nazis swiftly formed a new paramilitary organization called the Sudetendeutsches Freikorps. It was evident that the objective was to employ this militia in a low-level internecine conflict in the event that Germany did not receive the Sudetenland. During the middle of 1938, when these arguments were presented in an assertive manner, neither Britain nor France had the ability to resist Hitler's demands. As a result of the interwar reduction in their own armed forces, they were now inadequately outfitted to confront Nazi aggression. Consequently, in September 1938, a conference was organized in Munich, situated in southern Germany, with the purpose of resolving the matter concerning Schindler's homeland. At this conference, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Édouard Daladier, the Prime Minister of France, both agreed to Hitler's demands, provided that the Nazis refrained from pursuing additional territories in Europe. As a consequence, the Sudetenland came under German dominion after the Munich conference. Oskar Schindler was more profoundly affected by the German annexation of the Sudetenland than the majority of the remaining inhabitants of this region. During the Munich conference, he was still incarcerated on account of his espionage activities. This resulted in his immediate release. The time until his release was days. It is apparent that Schindler's involvement in the Abwehr during the mid-1930s was more extensive than he later claimed, as Oskar acquired a substantial fortune upon the annexation of the Sudetenland in the autumn of 1938 and his subsequent release from prison. And intriguingly, despite having been an active Abwehr agent for years, his application to join the Nazi Party was delayed for months due to his multiple convictions for public intoxication in the 1930s. This delay persisted despite the fact that he had submitted the application just a few weeks later. Upon its ultimate acceptance in the spring of 1939, both he and Emily had already established themselves in Ostrava, a city situated in close proximity to the Czech-Polish border in the northeastern region of present-day Czechia. Schindler resumed his espionage activities with the Abwehr at this location, continuing to undermine Czechoslovakia and Poland. However, the specifics of his life during this period remain contested, as he was reluctant to address his pre-war espionage endeavors in later years. The British and French had anticipated that the annexation of the Sudetenland would appease Hitler in the same manner as they had hoped at Munich in 1938. This expectation now appears naive. As soon as Nazi administrators were established in the Sudetenland, Hitler and his Berlin-based ministers initiated preparations for the eventual annexation of the remaining territories of Czechoslovakia. Although this was duly executed in March 1939, the British and French, who were in the process of mobilizing, refrained from issuing a formal declaration of war. This had yet to transpire by several months. Concurrently, the Nazis expanded into portions of the Baltic states through the annexation of Memel, a city formerly situated in the Prussian portion of Germany. In the subsequent weeks and months, Berlin issued its customary series of demands concerning Poland, Germany's eastern neighbor. At this juncture, London and Paris unequivocally declared that any infringement upon Polish sovereignty would be considered a military aggression by Germany. Thus, 2 days after the Nazis' invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, which was predicated on a false flag operation, the United Kingdom and France both declared war on Germany. As a result, the Second World War broke out. One of its most peculiar consequences would be elevating to international renown a Sudetenland merchant with a troubled personal history. As we have seen, the precise nature of Schindler's activities in 1939 remains obscure. This comes as little surprise. He was attempting to conceal his activities as an agent. However, despite the lack of knowledge regarding numerous specifics, it is indisputable that he played a substantial role in amassing intelligence on Poland prior to the German invasion. Consequently, it is unsurprising that he was en route to Kraków by October 1939, the capital of the German occupation government in Poland, in light of the aforementioned information. The German Wehrmacht swiftly subdued the nation in a campaign that lasted barely over a month following the initial invasion. Subsequently, a substantial portion of Poland was incorporated into Germany, while the central and southern regions were reorganized under the auspices of the General Government of Poland. The aforementioned areas constituted Kraków and Warsaw. The primary objective of the General Government was to organize this area for a contemporary form of colonialism, in which the Polish populace would be reduced to subsistence level and obligated to assist German immigrants who established settlements in the area. A significant portion of the Second World War was spent by Schindler within the General Government. Schindler's entry into Poland was not in the capacity of a Nazi official or Abwehr agent. His affiliation with the intelligence service persisted until 1940. However, subsequent to the Polish invasion, his responsibilities with the organization essentially ceased. Instead, his objective in visiting Kraków in the days following the conclusion of the conquest was to leverage his status as an individual who had facilitated the German occupation of Poland and Czechoslovakia and wielded influence within the Nazi regime in order to advance business interests in occupied Poland. Additionally, he possessed prior knowledge and connections in Kraków, having ventured there for business purposes in the past. Initially, his activities in the late autumn of 1939 constituted those of a smuggler and black marketer. As was the case during any conflict or its immediate aftermath, government oversight and regulation were minimal at this time, and individuals with a knack for negotiating were able to amass modest fortunes in the midst of the rapid turnover of properties and businesses. By leveraging his connections and a few favors, Schindler was able to establish an advantageous position for himself in this milieu and amass a considerable fortune in no time. He swiftly applied both his financial resources and his sway to a more substantial purpose. He procured the ownership of a factory in Kraków in January 1940 with funds contributed by several Jewish financiers who were attempting to conceal their wealth to the greatest extent possible prior to its confiscation by the Nazi regime. Schindler established an enamelware enterprise at the factory, which he christened the German Enamelware Factory. It began modestly, with Schindler employing slightly more than a dozen Jewish laborers, one of whom was Abraham Bankier, the former proprietor of the factory whom he acquired. It is worth noting, however, that Schindler's decision to employ Jewish laborers at this juncture might have been influenced more by economic considerations than ethical considerations, given that Kraków was home to a substantial Jewish population and the German occupation government had enacted regulations mandating that Jews be compensated at a lower rate than their Polish counterparts. Shortly thereafter, Schindler began to employ an increasing number of Jewish laborers, as his enterprise achieved remarkable success, largely due to his adept utilization of his sway and connections within the Nazi regime to procure contracts for supplying the German army with enamelware. And as the endeavor achieved triumph, Schindler, for the first time in his life, not only emerged from debt but also rapidly amassed a substantial amount of wealth. In late 1939, when Schindler traveled to Poland, he was entering the region of Europe with the highest concentration of Jews on the continent, comprising an estimated 3.5 million individuals. This was of immense importance. Hitler's political creed was predicated on the notion that a vast Jewish conspiracy was at work to eliminate Germany and the Aryan races of Europe. The Nazis were virulently anti-Semitic. Consequently, ever since their initial rise to power in 1933, the regime initiated persecution against the estimated 500,000 Jews residing in Germany. Initially, this entailed the implementation of a sequence of legislations that essentially revoked the citizenship of German Jews and subjected them to economic and social persecution. The objective was to exert sufficient pressure on them to ultimately reach a decision to withdraw from Germany entirely. Nonetheless, there was a trend towards a more extreme stance on what the Nazis termed the Jewish question, even prior to the outbreak of the conflict. A sequence of organized pogroms transpired in November 1938, affecting Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. These assaults targeted Jewish residences, businesses, and synagogues. Tens of thousands of Jews were detained and transported to concentration camps, which had been established throughout Germany to house political detainees and alleged enemies of the Nazi state. Hundreds of Jews were murdered. The assaults that occurred on Kristallnacht, also referred to as the Night of the Broken Glass, foreshadowed developments that transpired beginning in September 1939. Given that millions of Jews resided in Poland, the Nazis could no longer rely on coercion to force the Jews of the Reich to leave once they had established themselves there. As a result, more aggressive measures were implemented beginning in late 1939. These policies included the systematic deprivation of voting rights for the Jewish population of Poland, as well as the coercion of the Jewish people to reside in ghettos in specific cities, with the Warsaw Ghetto being the most notorious. In 1940 and 1941, this area was converted into a vast open-air prison, where nearly 400,000 Polish Jews were detained on a surface area of less than 4 square kilometers. When the ghetto was at its height, an average of 8 to 9 individuals occupied each apartment. In spite of the confined quarters, early war life in the Warsaw Ghetto appeared to be relatively normal. However, this facade was deceptive, as the Nazis began starvation-induced deaths among the Jewish population there. In the months that followed, food supplies were so severely restricted into this section of the city that the average Jew could only survive on a few hundred calories of food per day. Alternative strategies were in motion to forcibly remove millions of Jews from Europe and deport them to the Levant or, in a particularly pessimistic scenario, to the island of Madagascar in East Africa. Nevertheless, these would swiftly be superseded by more cunning schemes that would profoundly influence Schindler's existence. During the initial stages of the persecution of Jews in Poland, Schindler managed to maintain a harmonious equilibrium between his business operations and the compassionate treatment of his employees. For example, Schindler allocated financial resources towards the establishment of well-appointed dining facilities and kitchens, along with a modest medical clinic, to attend to the employees' medical requirements, in contrast to the prevailing circumstances faced by Jews in other regions. Notwithstanding his affiliations and service to the Nazis, Schindler exhibited no discernible anti-Semitic sentiments. He volunteered for the Nazis in spite of their racial ideology, not in response to it. Schindler's favorable treatment of his Jewish employees was likely tolerated by the Nazi authorities in Krakow, given the generally benign perception of him. His excessive drinking, promiscuity, and woman-seeking behavior proved advantageous in this regard throughout the conflict. Numerous Nazis, who otherwise would have scrutinized his actions more thoroughly, failed to notice his exploits. In fact, during one instance when Gestapo agents visited Schindler's factory to interrogate him regarding some of his employees, he seemingly intoxicated them and subsequently discharged them a few hours later. From 1942 onward, Schindler's endeavors to provide refuge for Jewish laborers would experience a substantial surge in magnitude. This can be attributed to a recent advancement in the Nazi regime's treatment of the Jewish population residing within its territories. Throughout the course of 1941, Hitler and his senior ministers grew increasingly certain that they would not be held accountable to any foreign power for their actions within their borders. They had virtually conquered all of Western Europe by that time. Despite President Franklin D. Roosevelt's personal inclination, public opinion in the United States opposed entry into the conflict across the Atlantic Ocean. Only Britain maintained its resistance. During this context, in the summer of 1941, when the invasion of the Soviet Union commenced, SS death squads were deployed in support of the army to execute hundreds of thousands of Jews in Ukraine and other areas. A new policy was implemented within the borders of the Third Reich: the identification and detention of all Jews, followed by their transportation to various extermination camps in Poland, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor, where they would be gassed to death. The decision regarding the final solution was reached in the late summer of 1941, with implementation scheduled to commence in early 1942. Schindler gained insight into the Holocaust, which subsequently transpired as a result of the final solution, not by directly witnessing the death camps but by means of Kraków-Plaszow, a lesser concentration camp. Kraków-Plaszow functioned primarily as a detention facility and a labor camp, where a considerable quantity of Jews were detained for weeks or months from Kraków and other locations prior to their transportation via train to Auschwitz or one of the other extermination centers. Originally a modest detention facility accommodating slightly more than 1,000 inmates, it underwent significant expansion during 1942 and 1943, reaching a capacity of over 10,000 inmates at any particular moment and nearly 20,000 at its height. During their incarceration, individuals were essentially forced to work as slaves. Schindler entered this situation. As the conflict continued, he encountered growing challenges in recruiting personnel for his manufacturing facilities, prompting the regime to propose Kraków-Plaszow labor. After accepting, Schindler devoted the following years to attempting to save as many lives as possible. Constant opposition resulted from the fact that Kraków-Plaszow was commanded by Amon Goth, an Austrian Waffen-SS member, which contributed significantly to the ceaseless conflict. Goth was an inebriated sadist who frequently executed prisoners without provocation. Schindler was confronted with this particular individual throughout the duration of the Holocaust. Schindler's transformation from a partial participant in the Nazi regime who marginally treated his employees better than the majority to an individual whose solemn obligation was to save the lives of the Jews who labored for him undoubtedly took place during the months spanning from the summer of 1942 to the spring of 1943, coinciding with the liquidation of the Kraków ghetto. Despite being considerably smaller in size than its counterpart in Warsaw, the Kraków ghetto accommodated more than 15,000 Jews during its peak period in 1941. In the initial months of 1942, Subsequent to the commencement of the final solution, directives were dispatched to Poland regarding the eventual destruction of the ghettos. During that summer, the malevolent operation to transport thousands of Jews from the ghettos to the concentration centers via train commenced. This operation in Krakow was supervised by SS Oberfuhrer Julian Schörner as of the end of May. The majority of the construction was finished in a matter of weeks, leaving only a few thousand Jews in laboring capacities. As a result, the ultimate destruction of the ghetto was not carried out until March 1943. The operation was executed at the behest of Amon Goth. During this period, thousands of the remaining Jews were transported to Kraków-Pshay, while more than 2,000 Jews considered unfit for labor were executed in the ghetto's streets. Witnessing these occurrences, Schindler was horrified. Subsequently, his exclusive aim in Poland was to ensure the survival of the greatest number of Jews conceivable. In the months that followed, Schindler initiated his mission to rescue those who would later be known as Schindler Jude or Schindler Jews by utilizing his privileged position as a supplier of products to the German army. Due to the critical nature of his factories to the war effort, he maintained employment of Jews from Kraków-Plaszow even after the implementation of the final solution. By arranging for these individuals to be transported to his factories, he effectively spared them the peril of being transported to the death camps or succumbing to Amon Goth's sadistic desires. The camp commandant was rumored to have lazily wandered Kraków-Pshay while murdering Jewish detainees under the smallest pretext. Therefore, any Jew sent to work in Schindler's factories was spared the risk of imminent death. As the Holocaust progressed and the workers faced the imminent threat of expulsion to Auschwitz, Schindler frequently fabricated documentation to suggest they were indispensable to his operations. For example, Oskar granted certification to housewives and lawyers who possessed indispensable expertise in the fields of mechanics or metalworking. When others became ill or incapacitated to the point where they were unable to work, he also endeavored to conceal this fact, since in Poland during World War II, Jews who disclosed their illness or incapacity to work faced near certain death. These deeds placed Schindler in grave personal peril. Throughout the years 1942 to 1944, he was apprehended and subjected to multiple interrogations by the Gestapo. His convictions stemmed from allegations that he falsified documentation and showered undue favoritism upon his Jewish employees. Nevertheless, Oskar persisted in his actions. In 1943, he even embarked on an extremely perilous journey to Budapest, the capital of Hungary, in order to confer with two prominent members of the enormous 750,000-person Hungarian Jewish community. In that location, he furnished them with comprehensive particulars regarding the events transpiring in Poland. Undoubtedly, this information played a pivotal role in averting the loss of countless lives in Hungary during the Nazis' spring 1944 advance into the country and expansion of the Holocaust. Schindler frequently traveled to Budapest, where he returned with funds to support the financial operations of the Jewish resistance movement in Poland. Paradoxically, his earlier engagements with the Abwehr during the 1930s served as a preparatory phase for his subsequent efforts to aid the clandestine Jewish movement in Central Europe. By 1943, in addition to putting himself in peril, Schindler's actions were once more impoverishing him. Schindler's acquisition of substantial contracts in 1940 to provide enamelware to the German army had momentarily elevated him to a position of wealth during the early 1940s. This was especially true after the German invasion of the Soviet Union began in 1941 and millions of German soldiers and auxiliary staff required his products. From 1942 onwards, Schindler began allocating enormous sums of money towards procuring provisions and medical supplies, among other things, for the Jewish labor force employed in his factories. Each Jewish laborer was furnished with a meager quantity of food by the Nazi regime. Schindler recouped the shortfall. This was no easy undertaking for an individual who, during the height of his operations in 1942 and 1943, maintained factories in the vicinity of Kraków that employed more than 1,500 Jewish laborers. In addition, Schindler was compelled to spend substantial sums of money on bribes and could not proceed with the acquisition of the magnitude of the products without drawing attention. He would subsequently disclose that he had expended a total amount surpassing $1 million on these undertakings. At current exchange rates, this amount is equivalent to more than $20 million. When the war concluded in 1945, Schindler was in the same financial shambles he had been prior to its outbreak. In the end, Schindler's endeavors to protect hundreds of Jews from the Polish camps would have been futile had the conflict continued in Germany's favor. Had it transpired in that manner, the vast majority of Jews in Europe would have perished over time. Nonetheless, this did not occur. In the beginning, the Nazis enjoyed a prosperous course of action during the war. In the autumn of 1939, they promptly conquered Poland. In the spring of 1940, they executed invasions and occupations of Denmark and Norway. A remarkable sprint westward campaign during that summer had resulted in the occupation of France and the Low Countries by the Nazis. Britain, however, posed a distinct challenge. Its position as an island and its navy ensured that it was the only European nation besides the Soviet Union capable of repelling Nazi aggression. Therefore, following a limited-scale aerial bombardment and endeavors to coerce the British into capitulation during the latter part of 1940 and the early months of 1941, Hitler redirected his focus towards the Soviet Union to the east. In the summer of 1941, he launched a massive land invasion across Ukraine, eastern Poland, and the Baltic states. Initially, this endeavor yielded significant results, with the German armies approaching Leningrad and Moscow by autumn. However, the progress of the German forces came to a halt when the Russians invested substantial manpower into their military machine. The winter of 1941 was noteworthy for a variety of reasons. The United States joined the conflict in December of that year, ushering in a new alliance consisting of the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States. Due to the stifling of the German and Italian campaigns in North Africa and the subsequent Russian significant victory over the Germans at the Battle of Stalingrad in southwestern Russia, the tide gradually began to turn in 1942. The Allies launched an offensive the following year, with the Russians pushing the Germans eastward and the Western Allies launching an invasion of southern Italy that summer, following the successful conclusion of the North Africa campaign the year prior. By that juncture, it became evident that the conflict would culminate in a German defeat, unless the Axis developed a catastrophic debacle or the Germans produced a nuclear-capable weapon. Neither of these outcomes came close to materializing, and the United States and Great Britain established a new Western Front in France during the summer of 1944. Prominent cities in Western Europe, including the port of Antwerp, were promptly liberated by the Allies, including Paris. As the days of the Third Reich drew to a close, the likelihood that the Russian advance would enter Poland prior to the ultimate extermination of the numerous Jews that Schindler was defending against the Nazi regime grew. During the summer and autumn of 1944, as the Russians advanced westward into Ukraine and Poland, the Nazis initiated the evacuation of a significant portion of eastern and central Poland and the destruction of the concentration camps there. Although the Kraków-Plaszow concentration camp would not be liberated until January 1945, preparations were already in place to demolish the surrounding facilities by the summer of 1944. Schindler faced the imminent threat of having his entitlement to employ Jewish labor for his enterprises entirely revoked, given the dire military circumstances that the Nazi regime had descended into at this juncture. Enamelware was no longer deemed indispensable to the war effort. Mietek Pemper, an advisor to Ehrenstein Schindler and a Polish Jew and secretary to Goth, advised him to switch businesses and begin producing anti-tank weapons so that he could continue to protect his Jewish employees. However, Schindler used his connections, persuasive abilities, and a substantial amount of bribery to convince Goth and numerous other general government officials, many of whom were extremely corrupt, to permit him to relocate his factory. This was duly authorized during the initial autumn months of 1944. The relocation from Kraków to Brunlitz prompted the creation of Schindler's renowned list, a scroll containing the names of around 1,200 Jews who were to be transferred to Brunlitz for employment at Schindler's new factories. By doing so, they would be spared the plight of the majority of the Jewish population at Kraków-Plaszow concentration camp, the vast majority of whom were condemned to death at Auschwitz during the autumn and winter of 1944. Oskar, his wife Emily, who accompanied him to Poland in 1941, Pemper, and a number of others, including Abraham Bankier and Marcel Goldberg, compiled the inventory. It contained the identities of every employee employed by Schindler at his factory in Kraków, in addition to scores obtained from events conducted in Kraków-Plaszow. Nevertheless, the vast majority of them perished. In the late autumn of 1944, when the majority of these Jews were deported from Kraków-Plaszow, they were inadvertently transferred to Gross-Rosen concentration camp and Auschwitz via separate trains. Upon becoming aware of the situation, Schindler expeditiously secured the release of the majority of those who had been detained in Gross-Rosen. Nevertheless, the task of obtaining the release of 300 female Jews who had been deported to Auschwitz proved to be more formidable. Schindler appointed his secretary to that location, where their stay was prolonged until he consented to a bribe of 7 Reichsmarks per employee. This is the only known instance in which hundreds of Jews were permitted to escape Auschwitz alive and were subsequently relocated to a location other than another concentration camp. Oskar and Emily's primary responsibility after transporting the Schindler Jude to Brunlitz was to ensure that they were not deported from the location prior to the conclusion of the conflict. Its imminent conclusion was becoming ever more imminent. The Western Allies initiated a swift advance into central and southern Germany in the spring of 1945, after having penetrated Western Germany in the initial weeks of 1945. Notably, the Soviet Union initiated its ultimate offensive into eastern Germany in January 1945 and had encircled Berlin by early April, thus signifying the conclusion of the conflict. During this period, Oskar and Emily Schindler persisted in their humanitarian endeavors. 12 Jewish captives were evacuated from Goliszow, a subcamp of Auschwitz, in January 1945 in order to provide labor for Schindler's factory in Brunlitz. These 120 men were transported westward in a cattle wagon during the dead of winter, without sustenance or heat. They arrived at Brunlitz 13 deceased and 177 severely malnourished and frostbitten. Schindler opposed the Nazi commander in control of the train from burning the bodies of the deceased and instead arranged for their interment near the Catholic cemetery with complete Jewish rites. Brunlitz restored the health of the 107 survivors in the weeks and days that followed. The concluding days of the Second World War occurred during the early summer of 1945. On April 30, Hitler committed suicide in the Reich Chancellery shelter in Berlin. The following day, Joseph Goebbels, his designated successor, followed suit. Amidst the Russian advance towards the heart of Berlin, other government leaders initiated negotiations for Germany's formal surrender. Schindler, who held a prominent position within the Abwehr during the 1930s and had significantly benefited from the occupation of Poland beginning in the autumn of 1939, could have been subject to detention and trial at this time, similar to the numerous other individuals implicated in the regime. Nevertheless, he had obtained a number of letters from Jews who had spent considerable time with him, attesting to the fact that he had indeed preserved their lives. A gold ring bearing the inscription, "Whoever saves one life saves the entire world," was also presented to him. The ring had been crafted from gold donated by another Schindler Jude, Simon Gerrit. As the conflict came to a close, Oskar and Emily embarked on a journey westward with these items in an attempt to evade capture by the Soviet authorities. They accomplished this with success, and by autumn 1945 they had established themselves in the United States-occupied region of Bavaria in southern Germany. The authorities were presented with their evidence at that location. It was decided not to prosecute Schindler. The conclusion of the war rendered Schindler destitute, a state he had reverted to prior to its outbreak. Despite attaining a relative millionaire status in Poland during the early 1940s, He ultimately lost everything in the final years of the war by paying bribes and purchasing products on the black market to sustain the hundreds of Jews who worked in his factories. In the post-war period, he attempted numerous business ventures once more. However, they were unsuccessful due to the extremely unstable economic climate of post-war Germany. The majority of this could be attributed to his previous behaviors. After entering his 40s, Schindler's health began to deteriorate due to his inability to abstain from excessive imbibing. In spite of this, numerous Jews whose lives he had preserved provided financial support throughout these years. After the war, a significant number of these individuals had emigrated from Europe to the embryonic state of Israel in the Holy Land. However, they maintained communication with the Schindlers, and he frequently received financial assistance from those who remained in Europe or Israel. Despite this, he and Emily made the decision in the late 1940s to travel to Argentina, South America, which is home to one of the largest concentrations of the Jewish diaspora and a sizable ethnically German population. Their aspiration was to establish a new beginning in this location. Schindler discovered in Argentina that he was not a farmer. After attempting to raise poultry, he expanded his operations to include otters for their fur. Oskar guaranteed Emily that they would become millionaires in the near future due to the flourishing fur industry. However, complications quickly emerged when Oskar discovered that the otters he was rearing were, in fact, nutrias, a species of South American rodent that resembled the otters in appearance. Subsequent to a series of setbacks, Schindler encountered mounting obligations by the mid-1950s that surpassed his ability to repay in Argentina. The Schindler family managed to endure solely on the ongoing benevolence of the individuals and relatives whom he had rescued during the conflict. In Argentina, however, Oskar and Emily's marriage was short-lived. Years of enduring his infidelity, sloth, failed business ventures, and drinking had left her exhausted. In 1957, she may have regarded his act of abandonment and returned to Germany as a boon in disguise. Schindler continued to struggle in Europe. After a series of unsuccessful business ventures, he was compelled to declare bankruptcy in 1963. A plan to film a biopic about Schindler, which would have been directed by the renowned Austrian filmmaker Fritz Lang, failed. However, in keeping with his character, Schindler spent the advance he received on the story rights almost immediately. He was admitted to the hospital in 1964 hours after having a cardiac attack. It commenced a protracted period of poor health that persisted until his demise in 1974 at the age of 66. His ultimate demise from hepatic failure was perhaps not entirely unexpected. Schindler has been duly commemorated and celebrated ever since his demise. This, in fact, had begun well in advance of his passing. The Jews known as the Schindler Jude or Schindler Jews, who miraculously survived the Holocaust due to his deeds, provided him with post-war support during his difficult times. Significantly, a carob tree was planted in 1962 at Yad Vashem, the memorial site dedicated to the Holocaust victims situated on the Mountain of Remembrance in Jerusalem, as a symbolic gesture of remembrance for Schindler's deeds. This was interred in the Garden of the Righteous among the peoples of the world. Following a span of 4 years, the government of West Germany bestowed upon him the Order of Merit. As we have seen, there were unsuccessful attempts to create a motion picture chronicling his exploits in Poland throughout the Second World War. It is widely acknowledged that a film ultimately materialized in 1993 with the release of Schindler's List by Steven Spielberg, which was awarded the Academy Award for Best Motion Picture. In the same year, Oskar and Emily Schindler were bestowed with the title Righteous Among the Nations, which is bestowed upon non-Jews or Gentiles who perished in defense of the Jewish people during the Second World War. Among the active members of the Nazi Party, he was among the select few to have received this distinction. Character-wise, Oskar Schindler was enigmatic. An examination of his existence until the early 1940s reveals a rather muddled narrative. By his early 20s, he had developed an alcohol dependency and had been detained multiple times for public disorder offenses. His matrimonial union was fraught with difficulties, and he was involved in a series of extramarital affairs, one of which led to the unwed birth of 2 children, neither of whom he allegedly provided adequate care for. Subsequently, upon the Nazis' ascent to power in Germany, he began operating as a spy for them in Czechoslovakia, subverting the sovereignty of his own nation and aiding in the collection of intelligence for the Polish invasion in the late 1930s. Despite the inherently hazy nature of the details surrounding his espionage endeavors, it is highly probable that he was among the most senior operatives of the Nazi regime in Czechoslovakia during the mid to late 1930s. Then, in the occupied territory of Poland, which he had acquired in the autumn of 1939 subsequent to the invasion, he utilized his sway over the regime to establish his commercial interests. A significant portion of this amounted to the effective looting of assets from a conquered people, whose nation he had assisted in gathering intelligence on before the invasion. However, beginning in the early 1940s, the internationally renowned Oskar Schindler emerged. As the severity of the Nazis' anti-Jewish policies in Poland escalated and Schindler confronted the reality of the regime's actions, a transformation took place within him. Rather than viewing his Jewish workers merely as a means to enrich himself, he began attempting to protect them from the risk of death. Schindler's moral transformation was so profound that over the subsequent years, he devoted nearly all of the substantial fortune he had amassed during his early years in Poland to rescuing Jews from certain death at Gossai-era concentration camps, including Plaszow under the command of Aeschylus, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. During the final phases of the Second World War and the Holocaust, Schindler was personally liable for the survival of hundreds of Jews by insisting that they were indispensable for the operation of his factory in Brunlitz. Without a doubt, they would have been executed otherwise. His existence following the war remained equally turbulent as it had been before the advent of the Nazis in the early 1930s. This symmetry potentially served as an indication of Schindler's character. He was a troubled individual with the capacity to accomplish great good. Through the latter, he made an impact on the world. In your opinion, what is Oskar Schindler? To what extent do his initial interactions with the Nazis tarnish his legacy, or were they merely the result of his lack of awareness regarding the Nazis' true capabilities? Kindly provide your feedback in the remarks section. Until then, we appreciate your attention.